Good evening to all of you. My name is Rajkumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the first day of the National Virtual Conference on Economic Dimensions in Judicial Decisions, organized by OP Jindal Global University in collaboration with CUTS International. We are about to begin the second plenary session of this conference to be addressed by Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi. Before I formally introduce him and also talk about the session, I would like to say that since morning, we've had a fascinating discussion. We began with the inaugural session on the theme, the economics in judicial decisions or judicialization of the economy, followed by the first thematic session, which focused on economic analysis of public infrastructure, trade, and constitutional law. We then had the second thematic session focusing on law and economics, approach to corporate laws and corporate debt restructure in India. And then we had the third thematic session on law and economics approach to competition policy, digital economy, and new technologies. This was followed by the fourth thematic session, which had a very specific focus on an economic analysis of industrial innovation and intellectual property law. After these four thematic sessions, we had the first plenary session on the theme, Getting Policies Right for an Inclusive Future. And now we are entering into the second plenary session on the theme, Institutionalization of Reforms in Courts in India. As we know, the Indian judiciary has demonstrated intellect and creativity in a number of landmark cases over the years. However, even today, we see the judicial system of India overburdened with pending cases. Currently, India has almost 40 million pending cases that traverse across the district courts, the high courts, and indeed the Supreme Court. The ongoing pandemic has only further introduced new dimensions in aspects of justice, which will need courts to demonstrate adaptability and innovation on a continuous basis. It is evident that the Indian judiciary, even with all its strengths, is in crying need of reforms, not just as a function of the case overload or other parameters, but also due to the changing and dynamic landscape of the challenges posed by issues relating to access to justice, more strongly reflected during these difficult times. These reforms will vary from increase in the capacity of the judiciary to technology-driven record management to improvement in the functioning of the district courts and many others. Therefore, it is important that while we discuss some specific reforms across the 2 days with respect to the economic dimensions in judicial decisions, we must also reflect on the larger vision of institutionalizing reforms in Indian courtrooms. Hence, I am very grateful to have our next esteemed and distinguished speaker here today with us to deliver a keynote address on this very important topic, institutionalization of reforms in courts in India. Thank you very much, Dr. Singhvi, for taking time out to be with us. And I want to say that Dr. Abhishek Singhvi has been a very dear friend of OP Jindal Global University and Jindal Global Law School. And besides his many other accolades, I want to say that he has been a distinguished adjunct professor at Jindal Global Law School and also teaching full-fledged courses for our students. Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi is a senior 3-term sitting member of parliament. He's a former chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law and Justice. He was India's youngest designated senior advocate at 34 and also India's youngest appointed additional Solicitor General of India at the age of 37. He's a well-known author and columnist and a very visible media personality. He's also the senior most serving national spokesperson of the Congress Party. His columns have appeared in India's 2 top English dailies and have been published as 2 books titled Candid Corner and Straight Talk, both with forewords written by Dr. Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister of India. He's also an occasional columnist in major Hindi dailies, including Dainik Bhaskar and Rajasthan Patrika. Awarded the Global Leader for Tomorrow Award by the World Economic Forum at Davos in 1999, Dr. Singhvi has been the opening lead speaker for the Treasury Congress benches in Parliament for almost every major debate from 2006 to 2013. He has been the common factor in almost all landmark Supreme Court cases spanning constitutional law, corporate law, arbitration, and several other subjects. He supports many charities, including the Prayas Center for Destitute Children and the Singhvi Scholarship at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. This is apart from the sterling work done by him over a decade in Rajasthan from his MP-led funds, supporting over 400 projects in the fields of health and education. A book on his nearly 400 plus MP-led projects in Rajasthan was recently released by the Honorable Vice President of India, Dr. Mr. Naidu. His definitive legal analysis of the law of emergency powers in comparative perspectives was also released recently by the Honorable Chief Justice of India now, then the Chief Justice designate, and 3 other distinguished judges of the Supreme Court of India. Dr. Singhvi topped India at the school leaving Indian school certificate and did BA Economics Honours at St. Stephen's College, MA and PhD from Trinity College, Cambridge. He also taught briefly at St. John's College, Cambridge, and did a brief summer program called PIL from Harvard, United States. We couldn't have had a better individual to deliver this keynote address. With those words, I now call upon Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi to deliver his keynote address.
Well, thank you again so much, Raj, for an extremely generous introduction. Certainly not deserved in such glowing terms, but it's very kind of you. And I somehow feel that there are so many missed vocations which you could have had, not only being a remarkably successful founder, vice chancellor of this university, which has grown out of suddenly nowhere in the shortest possible time I can imagine. But, your events are so comprehensively organized and such large that you have a lot of advice to be given to those sectors also who organize such events. Let me just pick on the first sentence you said, that the Indian judiciary has been very creative. That is why the theme of your topic today makes you somewhat uncomfortable and almost hang your head in shame, because I don't think that a more dynamic, a more pulsating, a more talented judicial system, and when I judicial system, I include judges, lawyers, law persons, academics, all the law family in that loose sense. I don't think you can have a more dynamic and a talented system than the one you have in India. I don't think the kind of legal doctrines we have invented, which are the pride of India and the envy of the world, could have been imagined elsewhere. Imagine basic structure, that even a constitutional amendment is unconstitutional. This is an Indian invention. PIL, for that matter, good, bad, or indifferent, a remarkable vehicle. The power of judicial review, which Indian courts, from High Court to Superior Court, Supreme Court, exercise, would make Marbury Madison blush 100 times over in the US Supreme Court. There is nothing which is away from or immune from the judicial review powers which our courts have. Which is why, amidst all this elephant in the room makes us hang our head in shame, which is this mammoth backlog, arrears, pendency, clogging, call it what you will. And therefore, when you look at this topic, I always feel this irony frequently, and remember Benjamin Franklin's phrase as to how, for want of just a horseshoe nail, a battle could not be fought and a kingdom was lost. The problems which seem so awesome and so humongous are sometimes susceptible to such simple solutions that you feel angry, sad, that those simple solutions are not adopted and ceaselessly and continuously and consistently implemented. Of course, as far as your theme today is concerned, in many ways, business is the real sufferer. For business also, this is the elephant in the room. Business is the real sufferer because enforcement of contracts, recovery of debts, punishment of crime or offenders, stability, certainty, efficacy, these are no-brainer adjectives for a good, efficient legal system. And these are sine qua nons for a prosperous, for a pulsating business environment, which only a good legal system could give. Of course, I realize that part of our problem is the democracy tax. We willingly pay the democracy price, but that should not mean inefficiency, laggardness, a chalta hai attitude, a business as usual attitude, leading to this strange, tragic figure of arrears, as if it is something we are to live with, as if it is a given, and as if we can do nothing about it. As I said, I continue to be awestruck by the enormous inefficiencies and tardiness of the Indian legal system, which ironically is matched only by the remarkable simplicity of the solutions available to eliminate it. But before I turn to the problem, the nature, the size of the problem, and some of these solutions, I want to make a few more general points on administration of justice and reforms therein, because that's the largest subject we have today. Reforms in the administration of justice. The first thing which struck me when I started speaking on this more than 20, 25 years ago is the fact that till recently an overwhelming proportion of our law schools did not treat administration or reforms in administration of justice as a taught subject at all, neither in the 3-year nor in the 5-year. So you would learn all these nice, delicious, hardcore legal theories like basic structure, but what makes them work in what ambience, in what system, or rather does not allow them to work, is not quite taught to young minds. I know that is being changed gradually, but even now, large swathes of legal education territory do not deal with it. Second, the scourge of this backlog, according to me, can be met only by less talk and more action, by fewer lectures, including lectures like this, and more implementation, by less legislation and more ground achievement, because I believe that we know all the solutions or most of the solutions. It's a question of implement, implement, and implement. Thirdly, the mammoth number of barriers thrown at us, according to me, and I will try to demonstrate that, should neither be looked upon as a deterrent because the figures are large, nor a depressant. According to me, they are really, if attacked at the core consistently, they are nothing more like but a pack of cards, which if properly dealt with will collapse. Fourthly, and here Thomas Hardy is always reminded to me, if you take care of the small things, the big things will take care of themselves. A lot of nitty-gritty small things which we don't take care of. Fifthly, the approach has to be holistic, not piecemeal. It has to be multi-pronged, not partial. It has to be both curative and preventive. It has to be surgical, bold, unconventional, I would say even shocking occasionally, because it needs to shock people out of their somnolence. It needs to make the system lose its inertia. And therefore, it is time to be blunt and not diplomatic. As Palkiwala said, words have to be an assault on the senses if reform is to occur. And in all of this, on the general points, perhaps the most important is, in all of this, you should and can never underestimate the importance of attitudinal change. Something least quantifiable, least specific, but possibly the most important. The best proof of this I find when I was a much younger lawyer in the 90s, and Chief Justice Ahmadi, who had this passion for reform or administration of justice, but of course limited it only to the Supreme Court at that time where he was, made a combined team of Indian and American lawyers, a very small, tight-knit group, about 3 or 4 from India, headed by a then Supreme Court Judge Justice Saikia, and 3 or 4 US Court of Appeal judges just below the Supreme Court of US, and a few lawyers. And we studied the Californian system of ADR, where ADR was virtually invented. And we then made a module for the Supreme Court. Ultimately, of course, we are proud that our report, which I had the privilege of largely authoring, led to the amendment and the institutionalization of Section 89 in the CPC, which came much later on the basis of our report, providing a menu of ADR options. But the point, that is a different issue. ADR is not the subject today. The point I'm making is that that exercise between roughly 93 and 97 or 92 and 96 led to a change, attitudinal change in the Supreme Court. And all stakeholders, registry, litigants, etc., started looking at delays and case management issues. And we had at that time the lowest ever, between 30 to 50,000 arrears, 30 to 40,000 actually, for a long time. So both attitudinal and my last point, the importance of teamwork, cannot be overemphasized. And of course, in all this, the apex court has to always be a multi-role model. An umpire, a participant, a facilitator, an organizer, a catalyst, an observer, a role model, a mentor, call it what you will. It needs to be all of that. Well, friends, the problem is so simple as to be laughable. You can't have these fantastic hospitals, buildings, equipment, medical equipment, and yet no doctors. How will you treat COVID patients? Take all the best oxygen cylinders you have and all the best things, you won't be able to treat any patient beside COVID patients. Well, that's part of the problem, even if it sounds like an oversimplification. And I'm giving you September 2019 figures, but you have latest a judgment by Justice Kaul, who has got interested in the subject, and I has been kind enough to mention my article in that judgment 2 weeks ago. So there are the latest figures there. These figures don't matter because they can be updated. But the September 19 figures is that all the high courts put together, about 400 vacancies, all the posts put together. Imagine in a country of our size, we have under 1,100 judges. And if 400 are vacant, and the interesting statistic is that from no time since independence have more than 66% odd been filled. There's always been 33% vacancy. Now you can have all kind of horror stories. You have in Allahabad some 60 posts vacant out of 160. You have in most big high courts like Mumbai, Delhi, and Madras, 1/3, 33% vacant. The joke used to be that in the older days, the original sanction strength was, let us say, X. They increased the X to Y. And they find now that far from reaching little below Y, they are way below the original X. So this is the reality of appointments. You can't expect these big figures of pendency to even come down if you don't have judges. You have a similar, though not as acute a problem, but the load is greater there. So in that sense, you can sympathize more with the lower courts. Here it has been 33% in the high court level, I just told you. But in the lower courts, at least 25% of our 22 odd thousand, entire India has 22,000 odd lower judiciary. I'm giving you just rough figures. And at least 25%, 1/4 has always been vacant. How on earth can you decide to solve this problem unless you attend to something so simple as appointing judges, appointing sufficient judges, appointing them in time, and making sure that, of course, you appoint decent judges. Well, all of this which I've said has got considerably exacerbated in COVID times. Recent articles in newspapers suggest that this humongous, this absolutely dreadful and scary figure of 3.5 odd crores, it is something like 3.3, 3.2, 3.4, that range, has become 4.4 as of COVID-2. Now, as we speak, I'm talking of last week. Can you imagine on a 3.3 figure, we've added a crore, 1.1 crore. This includes the entire figure. Obviously, the bulk of this is in the 19,000, 20,000 odd district courts. Then there is the High Court in the middle, and then there's the Supreme Court. In this last 1 year alone, to arrears, not to filings, we have added about 75 odd lakh cases. This is the COVID period, so to say. And of course, you have further horror stories. None of these are my figures. This is something so obvious. Niti Aayog did this horror story without knowing that they were doing a horror story in 2018, where they came across a figure that at that time, that is the pre-COVID 3.3 crore figure disposal rate, it would take 324 years to clear the backlog. 3 to 4 years. Now, of course, you have 1 crore clear more cases added. You can add the number of years. I don't know the maths, but it is so dreadfully frightening that, it is not even worth discussing. Well, friends, it is to a large extent because of the fact that we know that we have to appoint judges in time. We know that judges are retiring on their birthday. We know the date. On the date of my appointment, I know the date of my retirement. We know the procedure is to appoint, or rather start the process of appointment 6 months before they retire. And yet, and we know that we have started a search exercise in all the high courts. And we also know the 5 best people in each high court. I've always joked that if you were to put a blindfold on strangers to law and let them loose in each of our high courts, say 3 good people, they'll be able to find within a month the 5 best chaps eligible for appointment to the high court. The problem with our system is that after locating these 5 chaps per high court, of those to appoint, we start looking for reasons to disappoint. Why I should not appoint rather than why I should appoint. And you then add ennui, dejection, frustration, anger, till many of the self-respecting ones withdraw. In all this, the politics of the judiciary would make the politics of public life blush. When J.G. Griffiths, an academic in 1965 or 4, wrote a book in the London School of Economics, a small penguin book, which he titled The Politics of the Judiciary, there was a huge uproar. People said, how the hell could you title something like that? Now, it seems that this kind of politics, of whatever you call it, the collegium or the judges, is something we just have to eschew. And I'll be dealing with this in a minute, because the Lok Prahari judgment, some of it on my suggestion, does deal with it and actually acknowledges it. But in all your business environments, in all your World Bank studies, and recent reports have quoted a well-known World Bank study in 1998, they have pointed out that this most deleterious influence of this is the business environment. It is not merely more judges or merely more laws which will solve this. It is an overhaul of the system. It is, for example, a system of assessing judicial promotions and performance. I'm giving only one example. For example, creating a weighted average index formula, which is a complex but a comprehensive formula of days of time taken to decide cases, adjournments granted, quality of judgments, number of adjournments, and blah, blah. We just haven't made, we do it for bureaucracy, we do it for civil services. We haven't done it for our judiciary. Take artificial intelligence, for example. I think it's overstated because we are not even at the basic stage. But certainly for aggregation, for massification, for finding out how your brethren are deciding the same point, we are highly underutilizing this. For example, endless appeals on the same point of law. People do not know, by the lack of use of artificial intelligence, why there need not be endless appeals on that point. But we seem to go along merrily, oblivious to how much the world has changed and oblivious to the tragic circumstances of the Aam Aadmi in this dilatory process. I was the opening lead speaker in the NJAC in Parliament. In these fractious times when we have no consensus even for walking 3 steps, the NJAC in both houses was voted by all 750 odd MPs minus 1 or 2. So the percentage of negative vote is 0.00 something. In today's times, you can't imagine that can happen in Parliament because everybody's fighting everything. Now, I was actually a very strong votary of the collegium. But the way the collegium has functioned over the last 30 years, I believe, it's as simple as saying that we originally tried central government primacy for 50 years of our independence. 40 years. We then tried collegium for another roughly, let's say, 35 to 40 years. So the time would have come perhaps to try out, not that it would have succeeded or not, the NJAC, which is nothing but an expanded collegium with a larger base. Well, once even innocent lions have tasted blood, they become man-eaters. So once the judicial system tasted blood in the early 90s with its collegium judgments and arrogated to itself the right to appoint judges, I did not think that the NJAC would pass through comfortably. And as predicted, it was held unconstitutional. No problem, that's a legal process. But 2 strange things. One, right through the 18 months when the NJAC debate went on in Parliament, law was passed and then challenged in the Supreme Court. To give an example of how little we pay attention to administration of justice. While the court was hearing this matter for 18 months, they took the strange, self-imposed, self-destructive decision to virtually freeze appointments. There is absolutely no logic because there was no stay. the original non-NJAC system, that is the collegium system, could and ought to have continued. But on some exaggerated notion of fairness and decency, they stopped it. So by the time the judgment came of the collegium, on the collegium rather, there was some mammoth arrears, which was unimaginable. It took them another 8 months or 9 months to just clear the arrears of the arrears. And these silly and strange things are happening in our system. The second oddity, of course, is that on the one hand, I arrogate all the power to appoint judges. And then I expect myself to be blameless when you have 400 odd judges always vacant in all the high courts put together. You can't have it both ways. You cannot have the sole and exclusive, or at least the final power, and yet escape responsibility and accountability. I do not blame the executive less. And something I've been writing about, as I said, for over 20 years, and now it is being noticed by the Supreme Court. A flowchart plan is now being put into place. Because take another small thing, how things were held up. And of course, it will change now, hopefully, because of this low priority judgment. The collegium, with all its deficiencies, would, let us say, recommend 33% of the vacancies or 50% of the vacancies. They would travel the tortuous path from the High Court through the Supreme Court up to the central government. The central government had a power to return, let us say, one name. Singhvi's name is returned. That name, if it is reiterated by the collegium, 2 judgments of 9 judges and several other judgments say that thereafter, if the collegium recommends Singhvi again, the central government has no power, zilch. But yet, do you know that all the delays at the level of the central government happen because they have adopted a very simple device. They say we don't say no to Singhvi the second time. We don't say yes to Singhvi the second time. We just keep his name pending. Now, as you know, there is, just because there is no specific power written down that, look, if you don't respond, therefore it can't be endless. I have written long ago that a single notice more than 10 years ago, even to a law secretary of contempt, would have solved this problem. But judges have been unwilling to act. So one chunk of the areas from the executive side is that if I don't like X, Y, Z, I simply first reject him, and then on a second recommendation, simply do nothing about it. And you've had periods of pendency of such names, in some rare cases up to 18 months, certainly above 1 year, and many above 6 months. But equally, as I said, the judiciary cannot escape responsibility. Some of these uncomfortable home truths on the judicial side were brought home recently in the very recent hearing of the low priority judgment, when the Attorney General, because both are complicit according to me, the central government and the judiciary. So when faced into a corner with the accusations by the collegium, the central government retorted by saying that, look at these figures. Of the 196 names for which recommendation was sent by the High Court collegiums, 94 were pending with the SC collegium. So this is the flip side. The central government causes delay, but look what happened. Your own family sent 96 names, 94 are still pending. This is for a certain period, of course. And there are many high courts. So this is at the Supreme Court level. Now they gave another figure. There are many high courts for which no recommendations for posts have been made by the High Court collegium at all. For example, of the 220 High Court judge posts, imagine out of 1100 total in India, roughly 400, just under 400 are vacant, of which for 220, no recommendations had at all been made. And the affidavit gave the breakup. No recommendations at all for 28 in so-and-so High Court, 23 in Delhi, 21 in Gujarat, and so on. Now, they also added that many High Courts have not recommended names for 5 years against 5-year-old vacancies. The point is, I can keep on repeating and expanding these horror stories. But the point of all is, why is this not done? You give lectures, you give seminars, you give all this, you give sermons, but a very simple thing can take care of all this. Your flow chart with an absolute management person monitoring every stage of the delay and ensuring that each side a whip is cracked to make things move. I think in this context, the low priority judgment is very important. Imagine after me alone writing for about 20 years on this, and everybody knowing this problem, that nothing of this which I have said till now is rocket science. It took so long because, and that too because one judge, Justice Sanjay Kaul, is a well-known reformist in this field, and he picked this up and he constantly flogged this horse. So we have now several useful things. One, of course, is it is known as the ad hoc judges case, but it is much more. The ad hoc appointment power, as you know, I wrote about it, was there originally in our constitution. For an inexplicable reason for which we have no time to go into now, it was deleted. It was brought in hardly within 2 or 3 years as 224A. It's a vast power because it allows, forget the Supreme Court, it allows even High Court Chief Justices to get people retired or recently left, not only from their own High Court, but from other High Courts as ad hoc judges. The advantage of this is that these are tried, tested people. You don't have to go and search for unknowns. And they can be put, whether it is X, Y, or Z number, they can be put for old 15-year appeals, 10-year appeals, criminal appeals, get rid of all this backlog. Not once except 3 times in our 75-year history has this power been exercised by the High Court. Can you imagine? People don't know of 224A. And not more than 5 to 7 times in the Supreme Court. Now, the Lok Prahari judgment, as I said, does several interesting things. It, first of all, activates, pushes, promotes, in fact, gives a huge laudatory push to this power, exhorting that this should be used. But it equally wanted to be very aware, perhaps it was over-aware and over-conscious, and therefore a little defensive, of the accusations which might follow that you are just being incestuous in helping retired judges, giving sinecures. So it gives a lot of useful safeguards there, some of which I'll mention. It also quotes a huge amount of interesting data on pendency. It explodes a myth, for example, that those high courts which have the maximum vacancies are the ones with the highest arrears. Sometimes it's the opposite. 5 high courts in India are responsible for 54% of the total 60 lakh arrears across the country. Of those 5 high courts, those are UP, Allahabad, Punjab and Haryana, Madras, Bombay, and Rajasthan. The highest vacancies, the highest arrears are in Madras, strangely, which has the lowest vacancies. And conversely, Calcutta, which has the highest vacancies, has lower arrears. So, these analyses are important. And there is also in this judgment a useful analysis by period of pendency, 0 to 1 years, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 15 to 20, like that. This data and this helps a lot in solving problems. Now, the safeguards given in Lok Prahari are important. They have made it clear that we don't want it to be a SOP and a sinecure for retired people. So if I am friendly with you, Professor Raj, I appoint you an ad hoc judge immediately after retirement. You are friendly with somebody else and you appoint. That's not the object. They say that the first safeguard is that the vacancies should be more than 20% of the sanctioned strength before you can use the power of ad hoc appointments. We're talking about the high courts. Of course, Supreme Court has a similar power where they don't need to do all this because it's a smaller number. So it's not that, you have just 5 vacancies, start appointing ad hoc judges. You need to fill it for the regular vacancies. Then it should be normally used for cases pending over 5 years. The idea is not that, the current work is being done by the regular judges. Third is that more than 10% of the backlog of the High Court which exercise this power should be more than 5 years. So it's really ideal for old cases. And then many other safeguards are given. But the point is, this is something very useful. The second set of important recommendations of Lok Prahari, and I would applaud, not because they have noted my article and acknowledged it, not at all because of that. We are very happy that the subject is being looked into. They have also said that you must have this flowchart thing. So 6 months before. So if Professor Rajkumar is retiring 6 months later, everybody knows his retirement from the date of his appointment, because judges, as you know, retire on their birthdays, unlike civil servants. Well, 6 months before that High Court with 10 vacancies, the process must start. So 6 months minus 1 month will be taken in making recommendations to the collegium. I'm just giving examples. Then another 3 weeks will be taken collegium to Supreme Court. Another 3 weeks from there to central government. Then another 4 weeks for back and forth. So you must have the name actually 1 month before the man retires. In fact, I had jokingly suggested that it has never been followed in the observance. It has always been followed in the breach. The post after retirement of Singhvi lies vacant for 6 months, 1 year. The post after retirement of Rajkumar lies vacant for years. So I had joked one day, I said the only way to force the pace on this is to make a rule, of course, entirely in jest, that in case a successor is not appointed immediately, the incumbent shall be deemed to continue beyond the retirement age. So there's no vacancy. Of course, that is a grave misuse and not possible. But this is the level of this whole problem. Well, friends, I have more or less come to the end because I would love to have question and answers with you. Let me just say 2 more things that I've done. Before I end with that famous felicitous quote of Palkhiwala, which I have quoted many times in these seminars, but it brings you in his inimitable style the problem. I remind you that we are now talking of the ABCD of judicial reform. This theme, this plenary, this topic, this elephant in the room is the ABCD, which is A for access, B for backlog, C for cost, and D for delay. This is the bane of our legal system, not the great fancy doctrines which you are taught in the classrooms, which are actually avant-garde as far as India is concerned. We have the best and the brightest lawyers and judges and law teachers and law students, but they don't work because the ABCD doesn't work. The second thing before I come to Palkhiwala's famous quote is that in the end, this compromises and hits economic business environment, which I believe is the larger theme of your conference, not the narrower one of the plenary, but the larger theme of the conference. And in this, I want to make 4 or 5 quick suggestions, which I have noticed over the years. Number one, as a practitioner over the last several decades, and of course, many of these avant-garde doctrines have happened more in the last 3 decades than before. PIL, for example. No inbuilt institutionalized post-judgment audit exists in our system. Mark my words, inbuilt, institutionalized post-judgment audit. So today, an environmentally conscious judge directs garbage cleaning of Delhi. Tomorrow, somebody directs sealing of illegal premises. Blah, blah, blah. Those examples can be multiplied. Has anybody gone back and after 3 years published a study that 3 years of stick wielding and carrot wielding by Justice Rajkumar, what was the actual ground result after 3 years on a statistical analysis? Forget the court doing it. There's hardly any institution, and I would exhort excellence institutions like yours to start doing these audits, kind of have an audit section. Number 2, this audit, when rarely done, much later, by the time it has become irrelevant, should be contemporaneous and should be not only quantitative, but quantitative and qualitative. Number 3, there should be a system of referring it back as inputs to the court. There are various means, I don't have time to get into it, but at least within 3 to 6 months after the continuing mandamus exercise is over. And although there will be resistance, as there is resistance to all reforms, and judges are very resistant creatures, mind you, but you will find that slowly they will start welcoming and indeed inviting such inputs. Because otherwise it becomes ivory towerish. It cannot be understood in the context in which the orders are being passed for grassroots direct benefit at the grassroots level. Number 4, no studies even divorce the court proceedings. Leave aside during, I would ideally like some kind of an inbuilt court mechanism. Number 5, the unifocal approach which you have discussed in earlier sessions, I'm sure. Study 1 is of the benefit done in the PIL. The second kind of study, of course, has to be how a unifocal focus may have actually benefited that unifocal focus point. I'm not saying it does. Frequently, it doesn't even benefit that unifocal point. But equally, the burden of that has more than outstripped the benefit to any other sector, the burden of harming other sectors, the economy as a whole. That again is a statistical and a quantitative and a qualitative analysis. We just don't have institutional mechanisms, courses, semesters, or more than that. I mean, you have, highly specialized institutes. I don't know why we don't have a judicial audit institute. And lastly, perhaps some of these, when the jurisprudence of these aggregates, and this will happen only after, over a few years, suppose you have 20 such studies, then perhaps those judges appointed after that date or likely to be appointed should go through some of these studies at their entry point in places like Bhopal Academy. Because it's just in many cases, it changes your horizons about the quantitative and qualitative consequences or the lack of consequences or indeed the deleterious consequences of your exertions. And this is howsoever bona fide your exertions may be. Because as they say, the path to hell could be paved with good intentions. And so, friends, I end by reminding you of what Palkhiwala said. He's turned many, many decades ago, and it's very harsh words, but it is our own person, most eminent person, using it for our own country. May I turn to the situation in India, which has the second largest number of lawyers in the world. While it is true that justice should be blind in our country, it is also lame. It barely manages to hobble along. The law may or may not be an ass, but in India it is a snail. It moves at a pace which would be regarded unduly slow in a community of snails. A lawsuit once started in India is the nearest thing to eternal life ever seen on this earth. Some have said that litigation in India is a form of fairly harmless entertainment. But if so, it is a highly expensive way of keeping the citizenry amused. If litigation were to be included in the next Olympics, India would be quite certain of winning at least a gold medal. Well, friends, at the end of it is Gandhiji's common man. Not the business, not the institute, not the university, not the professor, nor the lawyer, nor the judge. It's the common man who asks these questions. And I end with that common man question, which is, दोपहर तक बिक गया बाजार का हर एक झूठ, दोपहर तक बिक गया बाजार का हर एक झूठ, और मैं एक सच को लेकर शाम तक बैठा रहा. It is this शाम तक बैठा रहा which you have to address, without which all the other things cannot work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Singhvi, for an absolutely fantastic tour de force on the entire evolution of the various approaches, initiatives, and challenges associated with the institutionalization of reforms and courts in India. You have actually raised many more questions, but also provided very useful reform initiatives that can address this problem. And I know that there are many questions that have already come. And so we have, say, 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll take up those questions as it comes. Let me begin by referring you to a very pioneering work by none other than Professor Mark Galanter. As you know, Professor Galanter has done significant work on law in India, but also Indian legal profession. Way back in 1968, and this is literally over 50 years ago, Mark Galanter noted that Indian lawyers, and I quote, are quite unable to visualize any basic change in either the legal system or the organization of professional services, unquote. And he, of course, talks a lot about the state of the legal profession. My question to you is that, to what extent this challenge that we are confronting today with regard to the court, reforms in the courts, is both, particularly the lawyers, to what extent they are A, culpable, and B, they can play a substantive role in initiating those reforms and actually working towards implementing it. You need to unmute yourself.
I don't think anybody can honestly say that Mark Galanter was wrong, not only when he said it, but for, unfortunately, almost 25 to 30 years longer than when he said it. The good thing is that the comprehensiveness of what he said has changed for the better since the new millennium. But the change is too slow. The pace and direction is too slow. Resistance comes a lot from the legal fraternity, there's no doubt about it. And we'd be failing in our candor and our honesty if we continued that incestuous peer cloak of not being candid about it. But ultimately, it's a question that the whole system works together, judges and lawyers as a whole together. And once some harsh decisions are taken in the dialectics of the profession and the judiciary, you will find very quickly that the system adapts also. I know that when we did Section 89, don't forget Section 89 is a revolution in the mindset of Indian lawyers. It was our report, which I personally wrote large sections of it in the late 90s. It became law in 2000, early 2000s. Now, 89 was considered by large sections of our associations to be a kick on your legal stomach, to take away work from you. Today, the proliferation of mediation and conciliation, chambers doing it, lawyers doing it, personnel doing it, is very exhilarating. So the point of it is that you need to press on and follow that 5 R's of Gandhiji, that, first reform leads to ridicule, and then it leads to rejection, and then finally it leads to respect. So you need to persist. And ultimately, I think the rate of change of acceptance is much faster now. The openness, because of technology, because of, if you don't have it, your children have it. And if the children don't have it, your grandchildren have it, and they all teach you and they all change you. So I think that is a good thing. But yes, you must remember the basic germ of the spirit of what Mark Gelenter said, and always beware of it.
All right. Thank you, Abhishek, for that. Listen, some of the reform initiatives that you have proposed, and as you rightly said, has been in discussions by successive law commission reports, many other policy initiatives, including promoted by former judges of the Supreme Court of India. There are occasions when even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at times, including in the Judges Conference, and also law minister initiated law ministry initiated conferences have brought together reports that have identified pretty much these policy areas for judicial reforms. Now, my question to you, and I want to refer to an academic work undertaken by Bob Hudson, David Hunter, and Stephen Peckham, who have identified 4 contributors to policy failure. And they have said, and I quote, overtly optimistic expectations. That's the first. Second, implementation and dispersed governance. Third, inadequate collaborative policymaking. And fourth, vagaries of the political cycle. And they have said this could be the story of most policy failures. And the authors have suggested that there's a need to develop a robust policy support program if we want to be serious about implementing any policy. And they've also said that threats to successful policy implementation are so widespread that simply hoping that normal procedures and channels will be sufficient to resolve them is no longer realistic. At a minimum, a better understanding is needed of the processes through which policy moves and at how at each point of these times policy can best be supported. And they've noted 4 consequential points can be identified, which includes preparation, tracking, support, and review. Now, I want to bring this discussion to you because, we have been discussing this issue for a very long time. And my question to you is that despite amazing minds that have occupied both the bar and the bench, why do you think that we have simply not been able to address this issue despite the fact that so much of attention has been given to it in terms of the discourse itself?
Now you know the reason why I started with general points in the beginning. And the second of my general points was talk less, do more, implement, implement, implement. The argumentative Indian is not just a academic Amartya Sen phenomenon. Almost everything which I've talked about has been written or known for years and decades. Why does it happen? Well, the first reason is that India is over-legislated, over-written, over-commissioned, over-seminared, but least implemented. We have never focused with the requisite degree of implementation. All the 4 very academically and diplomatically worded points of your authors in that last work can be summarized in one I for implementation. We don't do it from the point of view of implementation, and after the idea, we don't actually implement it. Number 1. Number 2, some supposedly cussed or things or villains can actually turn out to be very useful. Today, the villain is the collegium system. But the collegium system has got one great advantage. Today, because it's the collegium system, if you have judges, just the first 5 in each collegium, not only the Supreme Court, following this plan of implementation, let's say the 10 things I talked about today, or the 5 things which Lok Prahari talks about, you don't need anything. You don't need seminars, you don't need legislation, you don't need policy initiatives also, unless you call what they are doing policy initiative. You simply need officers at every level who are cracking the whip that, look, 6 months is coming, Professor Raj is retiring, where is his replacement search? You see the sea change. Of course, you should have 5 such programs, including, doing away with just tracking, for example, having 2 tracks, if not 3 in each high court. One taking care of current filings, one taking care of old criminal cases, one taking care of old civil cases. So now these are such commonsensical things. We need to only push up tighten our belts and work on this. And the rest will follow. The third thing, which all these 3 authors would not write about because they were writing academically. I'm talking of the practical operational reality. The third is that we have too much of individualism, too much of mid-course correction. So when I succeed you as the Chief Justice, merely because I want to leave some stamp, I will just make some changes. Now you may be good, bad or indifferent, but I've not allowed your policy to work even halfway through. It doesn't start showing effects before I tweak it. Take those fast track courts. Remember the fast track courts?
Yeah.
They did some great work. In some states, they did not do so work. Ultimately, they were largely scrapped, or rather not scrapped, but they said the funding of that is reduced. We don't have fundings. Take the Gram Nyayalaya. The big 2009, I remember the big debate, and it was to some extent useful at the very petty, small, lower level. Those cases are massive in numbers, and it would have taken care of them. But again, people lost interest because the successor wanted a change and a new stamp. So we need to, once we decide, you can take 3 months to decide. Once you decide, the decision should have the last clause, this shall not be changed for a minimum of 5 years of consistent implementation. You will see the results. I can challenge you, Raj, in the 3rd year onwards. But many of these policies are fallen by the wayside. I could recite so many. I've given only 2 examples. So these are the things which we need to look at. It's so simple. I would say it's commonsensical and it's very nitty-gritty, which is why I both gave those 5 principles, including Thomas Hardy in the beginning.
Yeah, yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Singhvi. There are several questions coming, but we have only 7-8 minutes. I want to shift gears and move into something that you talked about, which is as a part of the institutional reform, the elephant in the room, the judicial appointments. Now, I was somebody who, even before the judgment came, I wrote extensively, but also in an article in the Economic and Political Weekly, I said that judgment, that law will be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and it so happened. And but in another article, I mentioned one of the things I talked about in the future of collegium, and I want to give that idea, and is that what is needed, I believe, is an office of judicial appointments, which will have its own staff headed by a director and other staff members whose main responsibility is to process all applications for the review of members of the collegium. The processing of applications is not a routine mechanism, but rather a comprehensive and rigorous mechanism that will involve an entire administrative system to ensure that all information is duly collected and collated for the examination of the members of the collegium. Now, one of the major challenges, as we know in the collegium system, is the lack of time and attention given by the judges to the appointment process, along with their primary duties and responsibilities of hearing cases, adjudicating matters, and of course, writing judgments. So the question is there a possibility of creating such an independent body that will manage the appointment process of judges?
You must see the real problem, the real issue here, and you'll get the answer immediately. This again underlines that phrase, if we take care of the small things, the big things will take care of themselves. But it's not a small thing, it's the big thing itself, which seemingly is the small thing. Now, do you know that this is something which has to be done? But let me link it with another point. When you evaluate judges in the collegium, after all, you are doing about 1100 odd high court judges. and 35 odd Supreme Court judges. Now, different collegiums to have broad uniformity and also to have intergenerational equality. Would you not want to broadly mark them on similar parameters? So the collegium of 5, how do I know how Judge Raj is marking me versus Judge X versus Judge Y? Now, the first point is nobody is saying you disclose your marking. Nobody is saying it should be subject to RTI. Nobody is saying that it should be even available. But even within yourselves, there are no consistent 5 columns. For example, column 1, quality of judgments written. Column 2, integrity. Column 3, years of, rather, success as a lawyer. Column 4, I don't care. I'm not saying the other columns. I think it can be any such 5 columns. And the weightage can be anything you decide. But the point is, and though it will not be disclosed, it will be secret, it will be your decision. Even that is not done today. Why not? Because there is no scientific approach to this problem. The same reason is why your Office of Judicial Appointments failed. It actually happened. It actually happened in real life. An apprehension was expressed that if you make such an office, it will be subject to RTI. And RTI will have to disclose all these papers. It could easily have been obviated. It need not be. Because I am one of those who believes that when you do sensitive things like judicial appointments, splashing and sensationalism should not be the object. But at least within yourselves, it would be efficient, is the point you are making. Within yourself, it will be consistent. Within yourself, it will be uniform. Within yourself, it will have an intergenerational consistency. So that this generation of collegium, it appoints, the next generation appoints broadly on similar criteria. Now, these things are just not looked at. They're not thought of. They're not adverted to. And I see no reason, and I think there are some excellent Chief Justices coming up down the line in the next decade and 2 decades.
Well, thank you very much.
Open to ideas. Why should they not take up these ideas? I don't understand. There's no reason.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Singhvi, for that. Let me move into something that has been talked about. You yourself have done work on this. Now, it is not that we have not identified new ways to address this problem. For example, there was a point of time, at least a decade ago or more, different forms of alternative dispute resolution, including arbitration, mediation, conciliation, have all been identified to address some aspects of the choking that is happening in the legal system in relation to matters ending up in the court. In fact, the same Mark Galanter famously observed that it's not that Indians are more litigious because one would think that because so many cases are pending in the court, somehow Indian society is more litigious. He actually said it isn't, and empirically he proved that it is not so much. There are more. It's that there are not many more cases coming into the system, but once these cases come in, they just don't get out or take longer time to actually get out. So the question is, why do you think that largely arbitration and ADR as a phenomenon, both in relation to mediation and conciliation, in my view at least, has been a phenomenal failure when it comes to promoting reforms in the court system in India?
I think this may require a more nuanced answer, Raj, but of course this could be a seminar topic itself, so I have to be very quick and brief, but it will take 2-3 minutes. I think the answer is a little more nuanced. I agree with large parts of your formulation, but I disagree with some because of the nuance. One, it's very clear that arbitration has been a phenomenal failure, but not necessarily ADR. It's also, number 2, very clear that ADR has been a late starter, but has actually caught on like wildfire in the last decade. Number 3, judges are now relying more on ADR than on arbitration. Number 4, arbitration has been treated as pre-litigation litigation in India. And it has all the ABCD ills: access, backlog, cost and delay, with which the legal system is afflicted. You remember, arbitration was the original bypass to litigation. Now, why did we start considering ADR? Why did we write the report of 1997, which became Section 89? Because we had to perforce consider alternative bypasses to arbitration itself, which is why ADR was born virtually. Now, when we did this study in California, we found that 5 out of 100 cases go to trial. This is, I'm talking of when I wrote the report in the late 90s. 5 out of 100 cases filed in California, 5 go to trial. 95 are settled outside. There is some such similar ridiculous figure when you go in appeal. Out of 100, not more than 90. In fact, you have a pre-appellate conciliation or mediation system. Now we have a menu. Remember, of course, one thing. When we studied it, we found curiously that there were 6 alternatives in US. And we could not adopt one because the 6th one there was judicial settlement. That is mediation and conciliation by a sitting judge who would not be the trial judge. Now, since you have a paucity of 40% vacancy here, we could not very well suggest that judges who can't do their own rosters will start doing mediation also as sitting judges. Right. So that statistically in California was found to have the highest success rate. We don't have it here because somehow judges inspire more confidence if they are sitting, but we don't have it here. But nevertheless, today you have had an increasing culture, Samadhan and the other one, I forget the name, Delhi High Court, and each of the affiliated centers in each High Court, and now with the district courts, are getting a lot of referrals. The difference is that they are mostly smaller cases and restricted to only, let us say, 10 subjects or 5 subjects, matrimonial, land acquisition, motor vehicle. We need to expand that. And we need to start having specialized lawyer chambers, which today I should call myself a mediation chamber. Why should I call myself a IPR chamber only? Why should I call myself a sports entertainment law chamber? You can also have chambers which are mediation and this was there in JAMS, Judicial Arbitration Mediation Services in California, when I studied this system in 1993-94. A chamber of lawyers exclusively devoted to these services is growing in India now, mind you. I know many people are doing well in that, but I'm saying that this needs to be pushed. I think the judges are the best people to push it. The more they say that we give more confidence to setting it out for 2 months to this chamber, let them do it, the better. And lastly, they have to be considered as reasonably paying services. Today, the problem with the High Court affiliated centers is that a large chunk of the work there is unpaid. Yeah. And somehow the value of something increases unless it is unpaid, unless it is paid.
Well, listen, we could keep going on with this. What an extraordinary exposition of, compelling perspectives. I really want to take this moment to thank you and appreciate you for being part of this conference and delivering an inspiring keynote address. I have many more questions that are waiting, and I don't think I'll be able to take it. I just want to say that thank you very much for being here. For all those viewers, the entire session is out there in YouTube, and I hope that many of you who have missed can watch, but I know many of you have watched this live. We will be back tomorrow when we start tomorrow's proceedings at 9:15 a.m. on Judges Colloquium on the theme, the role of economic analysis of law in India. We will have Honorable Mr. Justice Swatandra Kumar, former Judge Supreme Court of India, Honorable Mr. Justice B.N. Sri Krishna, former Judge Supreme Court of India, Honorable Mr. Justice Madan Lokur, former Judge Supreme Court of India, joining me in this colloquium. Thank you very much once again, and thank you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you so much. Thank you.